everyone, welcome back to Book Lust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today at University Bookstore is writer Debra Dean. Debra, it's nice to have you back in your native state.
It feels so good to be back here. Thank you.
Years ago, when the Madonnas of Leningrad came out, we did a show together, and that was fascinating to hear your process and how you decided to write that book, what led up to that. And your new book, Hidden Tapestry, is about a very complex man, Yoors, and his relationships and his place in the world, in the art world. So, with that long introduction, my question is, how did you happen upon this artist that not a lot of people are familiar with? And
yeah, for all intents and purposes, unknown.
Okay, I didn't want to say, because once I was talking about a different book in front of an audience, and I said, and nobody pays much attention to the war of the French and Indian War, and this guy said, you know, I have something to say, and I said, you know what, and he said, I wrote my dissertation on the French and Indian War. So I'm never going to say
no matter how arcane, there is somebody
yes.
that loves this subject. And,
yes.
and Jan Yoors has a lot of fans, some of whom I've heard from. But I didn't know about him. And one of my good friends is a bookseller in Miami, where I live now. And Mitchell Kaplan, I came into his store one day and he said, Debra, I have your next book. And yes. You probably know this, right. That writers hear this a lot, and yes. It's never true.
Yes.
But Mitchell he's a book genius, so I had to hear him out. And he started telling me this crazy story about this artist, this Flemish American artist who had run away with the gypsies when he was 12 years old, and then had traveled around Europe with them until World War II broke out, and then he fought in the resistance alongside them and ended up marrying his childhood sweetheart, and then brought her best friend into the relationship, on and on and on. And when Mitchell was telling this, he said, oh, you know, during the war, he had one wife, and then he, you know, through the series of circumstances, he ended up at the end of the war with two wives. And I found out later that he had actually conflated the Yoors real story with an Isaac Bashevis Singer novel. But that happens a lot with Yoors, because his people that knew him intimately, when I talked to them, they didn't have the story right either. It's a complicated story.
Well, it's not only complicated, it's fantastic in the sense of unbelievable almost. So then what happened after Mitchell told you about that? Where were you involved in other projects?
I was working on another book, and I tend to be, I'm monogamous when I'm as a writer. Well, as a person in general, let me clarify that. But I can't work on two things at once. And so I thought, oh, this is really interesting, and I didn't think about it for a while. But then it kept haunting me, and that's how I know I need to follow the string. And so I went up to New York. There's three people in the story, Jan and his two wives.
Right.
One of the wives is still alive, and she's still living in Greenwich Village. And so I went on this kind of blind date and went up to New York to meet her and to see if this was a story I wanted to spend several years of my life working on.
Right.
And she had to find out whether I was somebody that she could trust to tell the story.
Was it because Jan Yoors was an artist? I mean, was that part of what drew you to it? Or if he had been a college professor?
I don't know usually until after I'm done with the book why it was that I was so fascinated with it. I just trust that feeling. And then I look back, and in the rearview mirror, it seems very obvious to me. And this book, the themes of this book seem very similar to me to Madonna's. It's about artists, but it's also, and it's about World War II.
Right.
And it's about survival, and about the things that people do to find meaning when their lives have been blown apart. And why I keep gravitating to those same themes is I'm not sure entirely, but I do find that I keep going back and digging up those same bones over and over again.
Did your interest in Jan and his life, did it include, was it unmitigated admiration, or what were were your feelings as complex as his life was?
The story was unfolded to me slowly. And Jan wrote a couple of memoirs himself, and I read those. And Marion and I started doing interviews, and I interviewed her for over 100 hours.
Wow.
And I talked to lots of people. And the first things that I knew about him, the first stories that I was told were all the stories that they had been telling reporters for years. And the others, the things that were maybe not about Jan, that were not so admirable, came out later, and only under duress. So I really didn't have a full picture of the guy for a couple of years.
Wow.
Marion withheld a few important details from me until she really did trust me, but it was a long process.
Yeah.
And so I come away, you know, I admire him. I give him a pass for a lot of things because he was so incredibly heroic during the war. And I understand, I mean, I think we would easily recognize that he had PTSD, he had been tortured by the Nazis, and so I kind of, some of his other behavior, I give him a little bit of a pass.
Did you think about novelizing this instead of doing it as a biography?
You know, I didn't remember whether I ever thought that before, and I actually went back and I asked Mitchell, I said, did we ever talk about this being fiction? And he said no, which I thought, oh good, because it became pretty apparent to me early on that it couldn't be a novel.
Right.
And part of the reason for that is because you need to have, with historical fiction, you need to know, you can't know everything. You know, you need to know a lot, but there needs to be gray areas that are the place where you can get in there and make stuff up and fictionalize. And here I had more source material than I knew what to do with, and I knew the real story, and it would have just felt, it would have felt like a betrayal actually to novelize it. Now I did end up having a couple of conversations with big New York editors that wanted me to novelize it, you know.
Right. Yeah.
And from a marketing perspective, I got absolutely why they wanted that.
Yes.
But I just couldn't do it.
Yeah, I mean, partly you think as biography, you trust it, that it's true. But if you read his life as a novel and going off, running away with the gypsies for, you know, at first months at a time.
Who would believe that?
Who would believe
right?
that?
Yeah, that was the other reason for not novelizing it, because the story is so bizarre. And with fiction, you know, when we say that truth is stranger than fiction, we're not kidding.
Right. Yeah.
Fiction has to be plausible. Truth doesn't have to be plausible.
Yeah, and the other thing that I just, like, my mouth just like, really? is his relationship with his first wife, where they met as kids, and weren't really in touch with one another for years. And then ended up getting married.
I know, and
having a child.
And if that was in a novel, you would just think,
I know.
What a hokey Hallmark kind of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It would be, you know, just oh God, that could never happen. You know.
And there were things. I mean, there are some things in the book that, you know, like I wasn't able to verify. And the thing that complicates it even more is that Jan was famously. What's the word? He was a liar.
Yeah.
Just the unvarnished word. So I was having to be really, really careful to get confirmation and for everything. But two of the things that I'm trying to get confirmation for is like, okay, his work in the underground,
Right.
and you know how, and his life with the gypsies.
Yes.
And if you think like, well, can you think of two sets of circumstances that are more immune to fact checking?
Yes.
I can't.
Right. And the other, you know, there's so much in here, like in your fiction, like in the Madonnas of Leningrad, there's so much that goes on around the main thrust of the story. And so his life with the gypsies, with the Romani, and what that was like prior to World War II. I mean, that's something that there's not that much about at all. So what did you do?
For his life with the Roma, I relied pretty heavily on his memoir for that. And if I had had another 10 years to work on the book, I might have dug a little further there, but I didn't. He's a photographer, you know, and he documented on film a lot of, there's a lot of photographs that he took of his life with the Roma, which are beautiful.
It would have been so interesting to track down some of the people that he was with.
They're hard to track down.
Yes, and I think that's the point of why they're called travelers.
Yeah.
I thought of that, but I thought, wow,
well,
that would be...
and unfortunately, most of his family was killed during the war.
Yeah.
And Marion, his second wife, thought for a long time that the whole family had been wiped out. And they have discovered since his death, they thought there was one sister that was left, and they've discovered subsequently that there are a few more.
His Roma family, yeah.
Yeah.
Was it harder for you to write nonfiction than fiction? I know it's apples and oranges in a way, but how
really
do you?
Not to me.
Okay.
It's really not. It was easier. I didn't have to make anything up. In some ways, the hard part with this book was, it was like a puzzle. It was like putting all of the pieces together and figuring out how these three stories were going to mesh, because I tell not just Jan's story, but also each of the wives has their story told too.
Right.
And before the three of them get together after the war, I had three threads of the story. And it took me a while to figure out the shape of the book and how everything was going to fit together. But I kind of like that. I like doing crossword puzzles, so it's the same kind of thing. It's a lot of work, and it's very time consuming, just because I had so much source material, and a lot of it was in Dutch, which I don't read Dutch. So there were things like that. And I had to kind of learn, about a part of World War II that I wasn't that familiar with. I had to be versed in the Hunger Winter. I had to learn more about the Greenwich Village in the 50s and 60s. But I enjoy all of that.
Yeah.
If I could afford to be a student all my life, I would be. And this is kind of the same thing.
Do you think that, are you working on something new now, or are you just taking a break, or you don't want to talk? I
am working on a couple of things, but they are just glimmers in my eye. I can't even speak about them now.
Well, the project that you were working on when Mitchell Kaplan came to you with this idea, has that?
That was The Mirrored World. That was my novel that came out in 2012.
Okay.
And it was also set in St. Petersburg, but at an earlier time.
Yeah. With the research, so talk about like the physicality of writing a nonfiction book versus a novel. I mean, I imagine you in a room with this book, with notes up everywhere and references, and I'm thinking back.
It's all on my computer. Yeah, I mean, in the olden days, I would have had a board with things on it, but it's all on my computer. The number of files in my computer that have to do with this book are astonishing, and I imagine a couple years from now I won't be able to find my way through them. There's a particular order that I knew how to find things, but there's just so much. I had to, I was making a timeline,
Yes.
and so that I could find my way through all of their 3 stories, and I was translating. There was 6,000 plus pages of letters, 45 diaries, and way too much material for me to pay a translator. Marion, however, is fluent in Dutch, and so we did this thing that, made me a little uncomfortable at first, but then we figured out how to do it, where she would translate, or she would transliterate, and then I would translate back a sentence, and I would be looking at the Dutch, and I got to know enough that I could tell if something was missing and she'd skipped over something. But we would do this, we would Skype. I went up to New York the first several times when we first started interviewing. But then I eventually said, Marion, I can't get on a plane every time you have something new to tell me. I can't afford it. So I taught her how to Skype, and we would Skype, and she would translate these letters, and I had scans of the originals. And it was so tedious. I had to turn the video off on the Skype so that she wouldn't see me going.
And do you remember back to with the novels? Did you reach a point with those where you felt, I can't go on, I must go on, kind of the way I think you did with this?
You always hit a wall, and there's always some problem that you have to solve. I am such a slow writer that when I'm in, it's not like, I don't ever feel like I can abandon something because I'm so far in. That might be a fault, but there I am. With this one, I got a completed draft, and I realized that I had written it as more as a traditional biography. There was a lot more quoted material. There was a lot more documentation, footnotes within the text. It was a lot more scholarly.
Right.
And I didn't want it to play that way. I wanted it to be a tale. I wanted it to be a page turner. And so what I had to do was I rewrote the entire thing. And what I lost were their voices, because Jan and Marion and Annabert, I had all 3 of their voices, either from Annabert's diaries or Jan's interviews or Marion's interviews with me. And all 3 of them have wonderful voices, and I loved that. Yeah. But what happened was it was interrupting the flow of the story. The story would stop while they commented on it, so I had to sacrifice that.
And is there stuff there besides their voices, but is there stuff in your files that you would have liked to have included, but that was maybe a little bit too much off the topic?
Oh, yeah.
What are some of those?
Well, there were some things. I restricted it to the 3 of them.
Right.
And there was fascinating things about his father. His father was a stained glass artist in Belgium, and ended up, and well known, and ended up designing a lot of the stained glass that you see in Europe now. His parents were fascinating.
Well, they were fascinating. I mean, even the little bit, the picture that we get of them, they were fascinating. And the whole Waldorf school connections and everything, and how that affected Jan, I found that so interesting.
I mean, like I say, fitting all of this, for the most part, you can tell from this book, if it was interesting to me, for the most part, I found a way to put it in there.
It's interesting to me, somebody who does a biography, and you have to think that everyone's complex in their own way, and comes to who they are through a variety of different paths and everything. But I'm not sure that I would have the stamina to stay with someone's life for as long as you worked on it. I
don't know that I would have either, except that they just were so fascinating to me. And it's a weird kind of obsession. I was dreaming about them. You know, I was, which is not that woo-woo. I mean, I
Right.
spent all day reading
Yeah.
about them, but then I would dream about them at night. And I loved it, you know? It
Yeah.
was, there's that thing that happens when you're a writer where you just sort of disappear and you get in that fast stream of the river and you
Right.
go. And it was fun for me. And I didn't feel, because I wasn't making it up, there was a certain freedom to that. It was just like, I just am in the background. I'm just here to serve the story. And I loved that.
Yeah. And knowing the beginning and the end.
Yes.
That's a big,
Yes.
a big difference than sitting
I mean,
down.
you know, the difficulty, of course, is that when you can't find the answer to something, you don't get to just make it up.
Right.
You know, this wasn't that different for me. It wasn't that big a jump from the historical fiction I've written to this, because my fiction is so research heavy.
Right.
And both of the novels have a very strong framework that's in history. So it didn't feel that different.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, because, you know, the Mirrored World is maybe the logical book between Madonnas and this, because it is a biography. It's based on the life of Saint Xenia of Russia. So I had her story, the hagiography.
Right.
Now, there's not much that there's nothing historically documented about her, so there was a lot of freedom for me to make things up.
Right.
But I still was using someone else's life.
So with you as a reader, do you read historical fiction? What is your reading like?
I don't ever read something with the idea that it's historical fiction.
Right.
And when Madonnas came out, the first person that called it historical fiction, I was offended. Because when I thought of historical fiction, I just thought of, you know, bodice rippers.
Yes. Right.
I wear that as a badge of pride now. But I just think it's a book, and if it's a good book and it takes place in history, I don't go to something specifically for historical fiction.
So what are you reading?
Well, I'm reading what everyone else is reading right now. I flew in last night from Miami. It's a 6-hour plane ride. I love those plane rides. I read Lincoln in the Bardo, and George Saunders just continues to astonish me, and I think he is maybe the kindest person I've ever met, and that really comes through in that book. Did you
get an MFA? I don't think I
did.
knew that.
Yeah.
So you went through a program.
I got my MFA from University of Oregon. And I teach in an MFA program.
Right. That I knew, but yeah.
And I actually had a conversation last year or the year before, 2 years ago, with George Saunders, because he teaches in an MFA program too, and we talked about that. And they were going through their reading period, reading the submissions, and that is a fully funded program, and everybody wants to be there. So they got thousands of submissions.
Right.
And yeah, so we were talking about how you deal with that.
Yeah.
How you deal with that and write.
And how do you deal with the...
You know, you don't ever do both things well. Writing well is a full-time job, teaching well is a full-time job. So you're always short-shrifting one or the other. And I think most of us that do this at some point along the line, we make a choice of which one we're going to privilege. I privilege my teaching, just because I have students that are live bodies that, you know, they want to be writers, and I have to honor that. And it's where my paycheck is coming from. It's more visibly, you know. I just think it's the honorable thing to do, but it means it slows me down as a writer, and sometimes I get very frustrated by that.
And for fun, for just reading fun, do you have like a, I mean, I hate the term like a, you know, beach read. That's a term I find offensive, because I think it demeans a certain class of books.
You know, I don't know what this is gonna say about me. Lincoln in the Bardo for me was fun.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
I don't go specifically to read something light. But you know, if David Sedaris comes out with a new book, I'm going to read it.
And he has a new one.
And he has one out
Right,
that I
right.
haven't read yet.
Calypso, right.
Yeah, but I've got a plane ride back to Miami, so.
And when you are talking to your students and you know, giving them advice or giving them, supporting them in what they're doing, what's your message to them?
I try to tell them what I need to hear, and you know, that to shut out the noise and the voices that are telling them, including mine sometimes, what this should look like, what it should be. And, you know, it's hard work. So it's kind of, I'm giving them two conflicting messages, it would seem. On the one hand, you know, trust this, play.
Right.
It's not going to be pretty at first. Don't worry about it. Just keep the pen moving, but then you have to go back and work really hard, and you know, some of them are willing to do that and some of them aren't.
Is rewriting easy for you, or is it?
Rewriting is easier for me. The first draft is the painful one for me. I could rewrite until they ripped it out of my cold dead hands, but for most students, they don't want to rewrite.
Right.
They like that. They like writing the first draft.
Yeah, and there's something kind of destructive about taking this piece of creative work that you've done, and
it can be painful.
Right.
Yeah, it can be really hard to take apart or throw away something that you created with your heart and with love, and it's hard to, you have to be really serving the piece and not serving your own ego. Right. But we all have egos.
Right.
My husband is my first reader, and he's my editor. And so most of his editing is helping me with pace, because I will put in more things that shouldn't have been in there, you know, and I need to keep the story moving. So he's throwing pages away, and you know, when we first started doing this, I would get so angry, and I'd say, you know, if you think I'm going to dedicate this book to you, but I trust him. He gets me, and he's kind. So I try and learn from him to do the same thing with my students.
Yeah. Well, I bet you do. I bet you're a really good teacher.
I hope so.
Debra, thank you so much for coming by today.
Thank you. This to me now, I really feel like I'm home.
Good. Great.